We're in.
You know, that's
I wanted.
second album, top 10 albums. Actually, his roots music is he did so many different styles. That one, Natural Blues, is his second album. It's my top one by top 10.
I'm usually late on that show.
I met him. He lives down in Northern California. When he's not doing, he's
Rotate. Okay, want to announce
I don't know if I turned that on.
what? No, it's okay.
The mic.
Oh, the mic?
Yeah.
I don't know. Left nostril breathing. That'll help cool you down faster. All right. Just want to do a commercial for Ulrich, brother who is works in our English department. Summer class, summer term, intro to film, blaxploitation. You register actually through the English department because it's language, literature, and communications department. Intro to film, blaxploitation, English 197. There's the CRN 10417, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 12 to 2:50. And screening is a separate delivery Thursdays from 3 to 4:50. Different CRN 10877. So you have to sign up for both of those. So films include Superfly, Cleopatra Jones, Shaft, and more. One of the reasons, actually the course that I thought about doing in companion to this course not only would include blaxploitation, but also other historical films that are not necessarily mainstream. But one of the things I like about Ulrich's focus and these particular films is that in some of them they become the role models for people that follow. So basically with the destruction of the Black Power movements, which are emphasizing African culture and political activism, political and cultural historical awareness, these films project a role model that is essentially underground capitalist focus. And so, you know, the pimp and the player, conforming to the code of the pimp of the player, as Talib Kweli talked about.
Those are great soundtracks.
Yeah. They do have great soundtracks, black artists, black filmmakers, etc. But they're period pieces that have an effect beyond just simply looking at black culture. So I wanted to talk about today, so that's that, Pan-African liberation struggles, American liberation struggles, and constructs for liberation schools, which are some of the things that we started talking about. What I mean by we is we in the 60s and 70s as student activists talked about as a counter to what became the ethnic studies movement, or the beginning of the ethnic studies movement. So this class is part of the African American experience, the third term, A Luta Continua, The Struggle Continues, which are actually, there's two different songs, one by Miriam Makeba, and where she basically talks about the African struggle, and a reggae song by Big Youth called A Luta Continue, which basically talks about a lot of the same thing, except in a more American and African diaspora context. So the African American experience requires that we look at Africa and look to Africa for examples and also for guidance and to give guidance. So both for guidance in terms of historical reference. So look to Africa for historical, cultural, and technological guidance. And what I mean by technological guidance is how to do stuff. Because technology does not mean just gadgets. Technology means how to do things. Because ology literally means study of technique. So Africa is the source of our strength. America is the test of our strength. So the source of our strength versus the tech. And to give back to Africa our fresh perspective. So as early as the 1900s, great African American thinkers like W.B. Du Bois were talking about this. So Du Bois talked about dual consciousness. And in a African logic point of view, and I'll be talking about that when I hand back the midterm on Wednesday. Logic. Y'all need to understand that question that largely you answered wrong when you said there's no logic. You need to understand there is a logic. The logic does not necessarily mean that it's true. Okay? When they talk about a logical fallacy, that means you logically came to the wrong answer. Okay? So you can logically come to a wrong answer, even though it seems like it's right, but it ain't. Right? So understand, logic is a means of reasoning to an answer. The answer don't have to be true. And the way of distinguishing this is a logical fallacy. Oh, well, no, it seems like it's true. Like, oh, all men are created equal, but white men are superior to black men. Wait, if all men are created equal, then how are white men superior to black men? In the same sentence, or the same document, i.e. the Constitution.
So it just has to be an answer. It doesn't have to make sense to you.
Right. So you can determine the truth of it later, but understand you can arrive at a lie logically.
It just has to make sense to that person.
Yeah, it just has to make sense within the logic system. So, and you have to determine that there are different logic systems in operation. So you don't have to believe what a crazy person believes. But a crazy person might not be actually insane. They just might be crazy to another framework.
Ted Kaczynski.
Right. Kaczynski, the Unabomber, for example. But remember, American psychology said that black people were crazy for trying to escape slavery. They logically reasoned that. Okay? Because their worldview said, oh, well, we were just jungle bunnies. Just to give you that framework, we were savages in Africa. Like Africa didn't have writing or numbers or pyramids or nothing. Just a bunch of Negroes running around in the jungle that were improved by slavery.
So the white man is also a logic.
Yeah, so that's the logic of white supremacy. Doesn't make it true, but you have to understand that that's what they believe. And that's why when I talked about last week, a person saying that I was denigrating her Christian faith by saying, look, Africans do not believe the world started in 4004 BC. We got pyramids older than that. None of our versions of the Bible give us start time of 4000 BC. None of them. That's a white dude studying our languages and concluding wrongly that the world started 6,000 years ago.
But that was logical.
That was logical, but it was wrong. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm setting that up. But understand, people can come to the wrong answer thinking logically. Logic doesn't always mean the truth. So when Du Bois is talking about dual consciousness, He's basically saying, this is from the Souls of Black Folk, written in 1904. Basically, you're a Negro. And remember, now we've evolved, so we're not Negroes anymore. And we went from Negro to Black, and then to Afro-American. Then what do you people want to be called these days? So African-American. Well, why can't you be just American? Well, because y'all said we weren't. Doesn't matter that we were born here. So, African American. So, dual consciousness. So, Du Bois is saying a Negro and an American. Dual consciousness. We have to blend both. So, the idea of that dual consciousness, the American Negro, he's reading, right? This is in the Souls of Black Folk in 1904, which, if you haven't read it, is definitely on the top 100 list of must-read Black author books that you need to do before you die. Let's just say maybe in the next 5 years. Read 100 books. Is that unreasonable?
100?
20 books a year for 5 years? Is that unreasonable?
Change your life.
Yeah, it would change your life. So, the American Negro wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. Now, he's writing this as one of the first African American PhDs from Harvard. He was the actual first African American PhD from Harvard. Not the first Black American PhD ever. That one got his degree in Belgium, because a lot of black people couldn't go to white universities because it was segregated.
So I bet he had a tough time.
Sure. Definitely. But he was a genius. So, this is a quote from a website that I basically had gotten that piece from. Always willing to assert forcefully that he was an intellectual force to be reckoned with, W.E.B. Du Bois was seen as an aberration, first by mainstream America, and then in his later years by much of Black America as well. Now, he founds the NAACP, but as he got older, he got more radical than the NAACP. Finally breaking with the NAACP. Well, they became more conservative than their founder. Refused a renewal of his U.S. passport because he traveled abroad. Du Bois became a citizen of Ghana during the latter part of his life, where he died, where he continued to pen provocative polemics, some of which can be found online in the Du Bois collection, or you can actually go to his house in Accra, Ghana, as I did, and you can see some stuff that you have never seen here, where he's basically writing from the point of view of, okay, look, the British have their Encyclopedia Britannica, which talks about all the things in Western civilization that they think you need to know. Y'all, that is Africans, need an Encyclopedia Africana, because you need to talk about your history as well, in order to create what he was looking at in terms of Pan-Africanism, like a United States of Africa. Not a unified country, just understand y'all need to work together. Out of colonialism. So that's my point being, It's not just Africans coming to America, it's black people in America. Like, there is a difference from kicking the British out 50 years ago and kicking the British out over 200 years ago. We don't have to think like the British. And that's often one of the contributions that African Americans make to Africa, the ability to think outside the colonial box. Du Bois is an example of that. So, the practice of freedom requires that you have to know what has gone on before, elsewhere, successful or not, and apply it to yourself and your own situation and that of others.
Well, I understand that.
All right, so what we're going to be talking about, because yes, syllabus says 80s. Covered a little bit of the 80s already, but I want to set up what has gone on in the 80s, because in some places, like, for example, there are a couple of your classmates that are from Africa, Zimbabwe, they had a revolution. Like, as an example, a resident of our town, you can Google Diversity TV, a television show hosted by yours truly. Diversity TV. So Google me and Thomas Mapfumo. So that is actually the most popular episode in terms of hits because it got YouTubed. It's YouTubed. And Thomas has been living here in Eugene for a number of years. He's like, so if you're a Stevie Wonder fan, Master Blaster Jammin', when he's talking about Pieces Come to Zimbabwe, when that came out, is after the former colony Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes Scholars, okay? Rhodesia, where we used to get chrome from and other strategic minerals. The former colony, Rhodesia, became Zimbabwe. Right? And part of the people fighting the liberation struggle, like Thomas Mapfumo, he's kind of like the Bob Marley of Zimbabwe. In fact, Bob Marley was welcome in Zimbabwe when liberation happened, right? But the Bob Marley of Zimbabwe, Thomas Mapfumo, his music, he was in prison, his music was banned, and he basically helped organize a revolutionary struggle that we saw in Zimbabwe that was very similar to the South African one that had preceded it, though South Africa at the time in the 80s was also under apartheid.
Namibia was.
Huh?
Namibia.
And Namibia and all those other, so when Mary Makiba sings a Luta Continua, she's naming Namibia and all Mozambique and all these other places that are undergoing liberation struggles. Back to slide, if you would, Kareem. All right, so but basically you have to know what has gone on before, elsewhere, successful or not. What that means is if you're going to do a, dare I say it, revolutionary struggle in America, one of the reasons that many of these movements were suppressed in Africa, because the Africans themselves were coming over here to study and going back to Africa with these fresh American ideas like, oh, equality? Oh, like maybe we should be controlling our own resources because they're our own resources? Oh, maybe democracy requires everybody getting an education? How about an education based on not only our culture, but also the West? And a few other things, too. Dangerous ideas, right? So some of those dangerous ideas were also being applied here in the 1960s, particularly, as I've emphasized before, the connection between South Africa and America. Some of the same things were going on there. They got some of their ideas for oppression of Africans from here. Apartheid came from Jim Crow. That's why you study Jim Crow. It's not just a minstrel, it's a social policy. Hitler got his ideas about exterminating Jews from our treatment of the Native Americans, putting them in concentration camps, i.e. reservations, i.e. South African Bantustans and homelands. The racists are getting their inspiration from the United States of America, policies against people of color. That's why you study what's going on here, because it's getting exported. And what's going on over there, because they might try that trick here. All right? IBM not only gave the computer technology for the Nazis to carry out the Holocaust, IBM did that. That's why you understand about Executive Order 9095. Okay? It's not just Ford Motor Company. It's not just IT&T, Siemens. It's IBM. Computer technology. IBM gave computer technology to South Africa to carry out apartheid. 2, as well, technology is not neutral. Okay? It makes certain social forms and certain forms of oppression possible. Hey, you may think cell phones are cool. They can track you with them. We used to be paranoid about them listening in on our conversations. Great. Now they can turn on your cell phone and track where you are.
Anything you text is there forever.
Anything you text.
It's there forever.
Anything. You gave them the power to be able to track you. I'm not trying to be paranoid. This is a simple truth.
The bombing about the
Right?
BlackBerry also.
Fortunately, they can't figure out what you think yet. All right? So, the practice of freedom. You have to know what the game is that's been done before and how it's being applied to you now. So, power is the ability to define reality so that others respond to your definition as if it were their own. This can work in 2 different contexts. 1, power over. I don't know who you are. This is Columbus. I don't know who you are, but you Indians now. And then they become called Indians. Oh, we can take their land because you are Indians, and real Indians come from India. Because Columbus is allegedly looking for India. That becomes the dominant narrative. Or, that's power over, power with. I see your capability and I believe in your capability more than you, but I'm going to affirm that goodness in you. There's several different words for that, which we will bring out shortly. But Wade Nobles, who Wade is he's an African American psychologist and also basically one of the foundational thinkers about Afrocentricity and also looking at how to do health promotion and drug prevention as well. Power is the ability to define reality so that others respond to your definition as if it were their own. And that is your concept of yourself. That's power. So it's an internal thing. Right? So one of the things in terms of the ANC Freedom Charter. So this was created in 56, and I've included a link there. So it's like, and this is that statement is from the website, the ANC website, anc.org. The Freedom Charter was a statement of core principles of the South African Congress Alliance, which consisted of the African National Congress and its allies, the South African Indian Congress, the South African Congress of Democrats, the Colored People's Congress, and is characterized by its opening demand, the people shall govern. So the ANC is black Africans So who you've got in South Africa is you've got you've got whites, and you've got non-whites who, as a divide and conquer strategy, the non-whites have been divided according to where they're from and how they got there under British colonial rule, as well as, Afrikaner rule. So you have Indians from India who have to form their separate organization because under British colonial rule, Indians are considered black people too.
That's where Gandhi started his activism.
That's where Gandhi started his activism in South Africa. In fact, if you watch the movie Gandhi, they're calling Gandhi a nigger. And we saw that with the NAACP attempting to bring Gandhi to America in the 1920s, and he couldn't stay in any hotels in New York City in the 20s because he's considered black by Americans, right? So our racial construct about, black people only come from Africa, that's not applied in other places. Yeah.
Was there some knowledge behind actually Indian people and African people? Like, do you think that went into considering them black? Or was it more of like a political?
There was some ancient knowledge and there was politics, both. Okay? So the ancient knowledge goes like this. 50,000 years ago, this is confirmed by mitochondrial DNA evidence. Okay? So your mitochondrial DNA you get from your mom. It's the oldest DNA. According to mitochondrial DNA evidence, there was a migration from Africa into India 50,000 years ago by black Africans that settled. They were called, in southern India, they're called the Dravidians, among others. Right? So when I was talking about, at one point that yoga came from Africa, not India, yoga was brought to India from Africa because at one point India was a colony of Egypt. Way, way back in the day. All right? So in ancient whites considered that there were two kinds of black people. One from Kush, which we now think of as Ethiopia, though at one time the entire continent of Africa was called Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a Greek word which means land of the blacks. So Kush is Africa, and Indus Kush, which is the Indian subcontinent. So two kinds of black people were recognized by ancient Caucasians. People from Africa, people from India. They were both black. Right? So there's a historical precedent, genetic component, and a political one too.
Thanks for straightening me out on that. I always thought Kush was really good weed.
Kush is really good weed, but there is a reason why it got that name.
Getting real.
Not that I know from personal experience. I have inhaled. Anyway. All right. So, since we're still on slide, so the ANC is basically Black Africans. South African Indian Congress was basically people from the Indian subcontinent who were separated from blacks, and then mixed race people who could be mixed from either one of those or whites, so they become lighter skin. So those become the South African Congress of Democrats and the Colored People's Congress. So colored people could be mixed race of any race, quite often blacks and whites, even though there were laws against miscegenation. Miscegenation is the old term for race mixing, which even though they prohibited it, it of course happened still anyway. All right? So in 55, the ANC sent out 50,000 volunteers countrywide to collect freedom demands from the people of South Africa. This system was designed to give all South Africans equal rights. Demands such as land to be given to all landless people, living wages and shorter hours of work, that is like 8 hours rather than 18 hour. irrespective of color, free and compulsory education. That is, it doesn't cost to go to school, and everybody has to go to school. Or that not only everybody has to go to school, but school is going to be free to everybody. Without regard to color, race, or nationality. So notice they're making a distinction. Because in this time, education is whites only, just like most healthcare is whites only.
Were they educating women?
Right, and that's another issue too. They might have been, or they might not have been. Right, so those things were synthesized into the final document by ANC leaders, including Z.K. Matthews and Lionel Rusty Bernstein. So there, at the site that I'm talking about, and I'm just going to headline, the headings. We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. That our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by a former government founded on injustice and inequality. That our country will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in brotherhood and enjoying equal rights and opportunities. That only a democratic state based on the will of all the people can secure to all their birthright without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief. And therefore, we, the people of South Africa, black and white together, equals, countrymen, and brothers, adopt this Freedom Charter. And we pledge to ourselves to strive together, sparing neither strength nor courage until the democratic changes here set out have been won. So people shall govern, all national groups shall have equal rights. So each one of these has text under them. I didn't want to replicate them. I'm just showing you. This comes out in 56. People shall share in the country's wealth. The land shall be shared among those who work it. Wow, that's socialism. All shall be equal before the law. All shall enjoy equal human rights. There shall be work and security. The doors of learning and culture shall be opened. There shall be houses, security, and comfort. There shall be peace and friendship. These freedoms we will fight for side by side throughout our lives until we have won our liberty. Now, part of what's going on here is obviously land ownership. The reason they're talking about common land ownership is because black people can't own their land. In fact, if you've been living on the land as a tribe for 10,000 years, the land can be bought and sold out from under you, and quickly was, because this is where, if your ancestral lands have strategic minerals on them, you can be moved hundreds of miles away in a homeland. Very similar to, again, what was happening with Native Americans in America. Same principles were going on. Same reasons, often.
Is this around the same time that Australia was a colony of Britain?
Yeah. And remember when I was talking about the UN movement for human rights, the Australian that was with John and Tommy, so he's wearing the UN Human Rights Coalition, he's wearing that patch, and John and Tommy are doing the fists in the air. So one of the things that he's protesting is the White Australia movement, which had been formed in 1901, which is basically doing the same apartheid business in Australia against the Aboriginal people as was going on in South Africa and other British colonies, former British colonies or former European colonies. Umkhonto weZizwe, the spear of the nation in Zulu or Xhosa. The apartheid South Africa government, of course, banned the ANC, even though that Freedom Charter came out in '56. Took them another 4 years to ban the ANC for trying to carry out the Freedom Charter. So when they did that, Mandela argued for the creation of a military wing. And this is a pattern that we have seen and will see replicated throughout Africa in the struggle for basically home rule.
Resistance.
Resistance, right? So, because of the violence of the apartheid regime was endemic against many of its non-white citizens, the ANC essentially went underground. So there was basically kind of like a civil rights wing, but the military wing, essentially, which Mandela headed, basically engaged in sabotage of government resources and equipment, and with a basic value of avoiding bloodshed at all costs, mostly because the example of the government where they're indiscriminately killing people, Sharpsville massacre, for example, in South Africa, which happened in the 50s, where essentially government troops fired on unarmed students that were protesting apartheid. So we had a pattern of basically government violence. So to show that we're distinct and different, we're only going to trash material and equipment. So this model actually gets replicated elsewhere, where in terms of the revolution that happens to create Zimbabwe, finally succeeded, those revolutionary folks are basically sabotaging power stations because electricity is whites only, or was whites only in Zimbabwe.
What year was the Sharpsville massacre?
Have to look it up. I think it was the late 50s. So the ANC model, the military wing is basically sabotage, not necessarily direct military confrontation, though the South African government certainly is going after ANC bases in other neighboring countries. And in fact, succeeded. This is one of the, let's say, for the sake of argument, that if you kill over 1 million people, that's attempted genocide. I mean, if you're going to use the term genocide or Holocaust, right? So it's not just, Holocaust is not just what happened with the Jews by the Nazis. 6 million, all right? Then, okay, 1.5 million were killed by the South African government in the 1980s with the full knowledge of the Reagan administration.
You call it the African Holocaust.
The African Holocaust, right? So that could also be referring to not only the diaspora, which is another Holocaust, but...
So there's no difference in the terms genocide and Holocaust?
Genocide is the attempted eradication of a race of people. Holocaust, well...
Carry out.
You'll have, depending on who you're talking with, so there's language conventions. So among many of my Jewish friends, they want to almost say reserve the Holocaust for that specific event without necessarily saying, okay, well, Holocausts have happened with other people before then and since then. So what are we calling a Holocaust? 1 million people? Okay, like 6 million, or the 60 million Native Americans that were killed by Americans, or actually by native count, 150 million if you count North, Central, and South America. There's just 60 million here in North America in a period of 200 years. I don't know, you're reducing 2 million Hawaiians to less than 10,000 or 50,000, depending on how you define, in 200-year period. Is that a Holocaust? Depends on who's talking, right?
Or wiping out the Aborigines.
Well, wiping out the Aborigines, I mean...
It happened on every
yeah,
continent.
so...
It happened on every continent.
Yeah, I won't necessarily argue the point, though I can understand why people might want to reserve it to, well, if you keep using the term, it becomes meaningless. Okay, well, let's define it, you know, if it's not meaningless, let's call it 1 million folks. Right? So, yeah, we're calling the Rwandan genocide, you know, that had a body count close to, you know, 1 million or significant, right? So... man's inhumanity to man, and it's usually men that are doing it, so I'm feeling comfortable using the generic pronoun, right? So there's going to be responses to that. right? And so we're seeing this within our lifetime, or at least my lifetime anyway, because I'm alive during this time, while they're talking about this. Yeah, I'm 2 when they come up with the Freedom Charter, and I didn't know about that, right? At 2. But, you know, I definitely know the effects. There was a coffee table book that my parents had, House of Bondage, famous coffee table book by me, and it's big, thick picture book. There's black South African photographers basically taking pictures of the effects of apartheid. Became a very, you know, popular book, or famous book in terms of basically the late 60s and 70s when I first saw it. So the example would be exported to other countries fighting the same fight. For example, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, that is, the military wings are not going against personnel, they're going against gear, equipment and gear. Because, well, shanty towns are not getting electricity or running water or sewers. So those utilities are whites only. And you can still see that kind of pattern visiting Africa today.
Or if you read Desmond Tutu. You know.
Yeah. All right, so Mandela was the first ANC military leader. In '64. He and 7 others were sentenced to life imprisonment, and he wasn't released until the 90s from public pressure. They are very lucky they didn't kill him. So, Ubuntu, which is a Zulu and Xhosa word, which means a union of allegiances and alliances. This is what Bishop Tutu said of this concept. So, not to say that Mandela and the ANC are the only ones fighting a freedom struggle. There are other groups that are working. So, for example, Bishop Tutu, the Anglican Church, talks about Ubuntu. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs to a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed. And he called that concept Ubuntu, which is, this is out of your other book, Molefe Asante's book. So he talks about a Zimbabwean scholar, Stanley Samkange, expressing a similar philosophy, claiming that Ubuntu was a Bantu philosophy based in the Africans' response to the environment. South Africa itself is largely made up of Bantu-speaking people. That's a language group, just like Algonquin is an indigenous language group. In America, Ubuntu emphasizes the need for unity or consensus in decision-making, as well as the need for a suitably humanitarian ethic to inform those decisions. Phrase in Zulu, Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu. Zulu, from the Zulu language, a person is a person through other persons. That is, the person one is to become by behaving with humanity is an ancestor worthy of respect or veneration. Those who uphold the principle of Ubuntu throughout their lives will, in death, achieve a unity with those still living, thus completing the circle of life. This also reminds me of a Garvey quote, which I'll have to dig up and share with you later. But Garvey basically talked about the same thing, about living a life that will, where your deeds will live on after you in terms of the service that you provide.
So by saying environment, do they mean geologically, or probably there were tribal warfare too, and that caused people to make allegiances as well? Or was it like living in the hostile kind of environment of Africa, you know, the bushland down there?
Hostile environment, what? Just because there's like 13 poisonous snakes that can kill you inside of 5 minutes if they bite you?
And
You mean hot viruses that, like Ebola, that can kill you inside of a week? Hostile environment, you know, animals? Yeah. It's not just the physical and biological environment, it's also, it's intense there. It is definitely intense there, you know, and if you go, I encourage you to go. as Americans, any Americans, because it will trip you out. I mean, it tripped me out to see some of that, to see this environment. Like, what does it take to live there? You have to work together with other people to survive there. Yeah, you can survive on your own, sure, but it's hard. You know, unless you have a culture that creates the type of individual where they're going to be self-reliant.
But isn't that the contrast of Africa, like living in a hostile environment and having unity?
Yes.
Like, for example, the Western world, you're living in a very well environment, and you're hostile to each other.
Yes.
That's-
Right. Living in that environment requires that you learn about other people. You learn to get along with other people. You know, I mean, watching the Star Trek movie where, you know, the enemy of my enemy is a friend, and Spock says, yeah, well, okay, that was said by an Arabian prince who was like beheaded by his followers. No, you need to understand what makes your enemy, because they're not a villain in their own eyes. So you need to understand how that works. What is their history? So that when you're dealing with their enemy isn't automatically your friend. You'll need to understand how they can make alliances and how you can work together against this person or whatever. Or you make an alliance with somebody who's your enemy. Both, all those things. So that form of logic, that is that what Du Bois is talking about, dual consciousness. Nichols were referred to as di means two, unito logic, which is the union of opposites. That is, I have to know not only my culture, but their culture too. I don't have to believe what they believe, I just have to understand that they believe it.
It's dialectical.
Yeah. Dialectical is another word for it. Lectic, that is to speak, a discourse. So in some slides I included at the end, I don't know if you saw them or went through them. This came out in 1970, actually the late 60s, early 70s, Paulo Freire, where he talks about false charity and true generosity. Now, false charity, what charity is if you have something and you give it freely. But false charity is used, and he's talking about a quality. False charity is used by people in power to maintain their power. And we can use the analogy that Malcolm X talked about and others, the people in power can give you crumbs off the table. They can give you a piece of the pie, but they haven't given you the bakery. They haven't given you the farm. They haven't given you the means to feed yourself. They haven't given it to you. They've given basically symbolic access. So I could say, there's an old African, sometimes identified with a Jewish proverb, but this came out of the time where Africans and Jews were the same people. If you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So in the IAM, the Institute for African American Mobilization, we extended that by saying, real power starts with access to the stream and fishing tools and swimming lessons. Because what good is it to give you access, if you don't know how to swim as a fisherman, you could be doomed. Because you might fall in. You need swimming skill. So, false charity versus true generosity. False charity gives a little something to the extended hands of, this is Freire talking, the extended hands of the have-nots, but preserves the haves' power. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or of peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication and become capable of working and transforming the world. That is, no, we're not looking for a handout. How about, like Jesse Jackson said, a hand up, but also, how about us taking the power to change the way that people live so that there aren't any haves or have-nots. That everybody has. And we're going to transform the world so that everybody has. Usually in the equation that when we talk about this conversation in America, the haves don't want to give up, oh, socialism, we don't want to give up our wealth. Well, after $1 billion, how much do you need to live? How much do you need, really, to live?